Professor Pongracic, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats.
Thank you so very much. It's a true honor to be here.
Well, we would love to have you start just by giving us some opening comments on the deficit and your thoughts.
Sure. I was just first thinking that I'm really glad I didn't wear that same shirt as in that photo. So that would have been embarrassing. All right, well, a little bit of levity because unfortunately we're going to be talking about a subject that is really not very fun at all. It's actually quite depressing. So I apologize to all of my young listeners in particular because it is yeah, it's a dark it paints a dark picture. So let's just start with some basic terminology, basic concepts, and I'll build from there and take about 10 minutes or so. So the government spends money. It has spending on one side, it has revenues on the other side. The revenues, in theory, are supposed to cover the spending, but usually the tax revenues fall quite short of the spending. So ideally, the government would have a budget. A budget would be something that would lay out all of its spending in advance, and then it could also plan how to achieve the requisite level of tax revenues to cover all of that spending. For the last 20 some years, we've actually just been winging it, even though the President of the United States is required by law to submit a budget. And that is supposed to be the starting point of negotiations in the Congress. The Congress has basically totally avoided this responsibility, and they're just engaged in short-term spending bills that are more or less based on pure politics. So we have had a situation where we have sort of lurched into continuous deficits for a very long period of time now. So if you look at actually, to define what a deficit is a situation where the government spending exceeds the government revenues. So there are three different options that can happen with a budget, loosely speaking, even if it's not a formal budget. You can have a balanced budget. That's a situation where the spending is exactly equal to the revenues. And the government gets revenues primarily through various kinds of taxes. Then there is the possibility of the budget surplus, which is a situation where its spending is lower than its tax revenues. And then finally, and most commonly, we can have a situation of a budget deficit, which is where the government spending exceeds the revenues. And that has been the most dominant form of, the dominant situation for the last 62 years. In these last 62 years, we have had 58 years of deficits and only 4 years of surpluses. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Those 4 years were actually accidental. They were not planned. And as soon as the government figured out that it had surpluses, it quickly fixed that to make sure that those surpluses did not continue. Whenever you have a deficit, you can think of it a deficit. The formal terminology for this is that it is a flow variable, meaning it is per some period of time. And deficits are usually measured per year, annual. So when you have annual deficits, what's happening is that we are adding that amount of money to the total debt. You can think of the debt as the stock variable, and I've seen it actually expressed pretty nicely. You think of a bathtub, the amount of water that's already in the bathtub, you can think of that as a stock variable, so that water in the bathtub can be representing debt, the overall debt. And then the deficit is the flow variable. That's the water going through the faucet and continuing to fill up the bathtub, raising the water level. So that's the difference between the deficit and the debt. And there are actually some people, oftentimes journalists, who do not have a great deal of education in economic matters, but sometimes actually even politicians, that mix up the debt and the deficit. And that is a sure sign of someone that doesn't really know what they're talking about. So beware of that, okay? So the deficit is an annual concept. We were just talking about how much the government spending exceeds the government revenues in a particular year. Um, and then the debt is the totality, all of the deficits added together. Okay. And so I know you had my colleague, Professor Gary Wolfram, last week to talk about the debt. The issues of debt and deficit are absolutely, linked. They cannot be separated. So I'll try to focus more on the deficit, but forgive me, I'm going to have to talk about the debt quite a bit because it's really, it's the two sides of the same coin. Um, but what we have had here is a situation where the deficits have actually been increasing. They are rising, and they are adding to the debt in a very dangerous manner. It used to be the case that deficits, they were part of the normal operations of the government, and everybody thought that they could be managed, that they would not be destructive to the economy and destructive to the future generations. We have gotten to the point where that is just not a certainty anymore. We are at a point where we actually have to start considering the destructive aspects of these deficits and the debt. So let me quickly talk about what makes up the deficit, and I'll talk about briefly just some causes of the deficit. We have a situation where the government has to make certain spending decisions without knowing exactly what its tax revenues are going to be. So the tax revenues are projected and uncertain, right? They have to make these decisions in advance. Whereas the spending decisions are very much certain. So they will pass these various bills to spend the money. And there is an enormous amount of political pressure for the politicians to pass larger spending bills. That is ultimately how politicians get reelected, how they become popular. And that, by the way, all of this applies to both parties. I'm going to talk about later on how there is actually very little difference between the Republican and Democrat Party. And so this is definitely not going to be a partisan talk. Both parties are about equally responsible for the current mess that we find ourselves in. But we have a situation where the spending has continued to increase much faster than the revenues have been increasing. The primary drivers of that have actually been two. One is the first one, the largest component of the government spending is healthcare spending. And we are talking about here Medicare primarily and Medicaid. Medicare is the health spending on the retirees. And even though Medicare consists of people paying into the Medicare program through their entire working lives, to their employment lives, the fact is that the expenditures for Medicare have been considerably greater than the revenues through the Medicare tax. So we are seeing an explosion of the Medicare expenditures, which is by far the largest driver of the rising deficits. Okay. The second component is very similar. So, and I should mention Medicaid makes up some of that too. Medicaid is spending for the poor, and it's the federal government spending for the health care of the poor. That does not make up nearly as much of the spending as Medicare. Medicare is by far the largest spending component. The second largest, after the healthcare spending, the second largest spending component is Social Security. And Social Security is very similar to Medicare. It's supposed to be a benefit to the retirees that they're supposed to have been paying into all of their lives. But just like with Medicare, we actually have a situation where Social Security revenues have actually been considerably less than the expenditures on Social Security. And both of these programs, Medicare and Social Security, are actuarially projected to actually go bankrupt in about 2035. So in about 13 years, meaning that the outgoing money is going to start exceeding all of the money that's supposedly been built up to provide for these funds as people retired. And of course, we have the second largest now generation in the U.S. history was the baby boomers. the people born between 1945 and 1964, if the average retirement age is about 65. So baby boomers started retiring in 2011, and they're going to continue retiring through about 2031. And that's the major driver of these programs being bankrupt, unfortunately. So the government has to, because more and more baby boomers are retiring, the government has to spend more and more on both Medicare and Social Security. And both of those are extremely popular programs. People think that they've been paying into these programs all their lives and they have earned the benefits that are coming to them. The problem continues to be that the benefits that they've been promised and that they are being given are much larger than the payments that they've put into the system in their working lives. So what we have right now is actually a transfer from my generation and the future generations in order to make up that shortfall, right? So we're going to have a transfer from younger generations to supply those, to provide for those payments for the retirees. And this is a highly problematic situation. That's been the major driver of deficits for the last well, at least 10 years. The additional huge problem with deficits, and then I'll shut up and I'll open it up to questions, is that anytime there is any kind of a crisis, government revenues decline because with any kind of a crisis, you're going to get much less economic activity and there's going to be less taxes coming in. At the same time that the government actually starts increasing its spending to help people, to provide various kinds of payments, to either for macroeconomic purposes to keep up aggregate demand, as the technical term goes, or just to provide relief to people. And we have seen two huge crises in the last 15 years, of course. So there was the 2008, 2009 Great Recession, the financial crisis, which has really started this current situation of trillion-dollar deficits or close to trillion-dollar deficits. In 2008, 2009, I can't remember exactly which one of those two, for the first time ever, we saw the government run a deficit of $1 trillion. And that's on a budget of about, I think it was $4.5 trillion or so. So that's how much it was spending. $1 trillion was borrowed of that $4.5 trillion. Okay, so about 1/4 of the money that the government was spending at that point, it was borrowing. Once that crisis, and that was due to both much larger spending and much lower tax revenues. Once the recession ended and the crisis ended, we continued to see actually close to $1 trillion deficits for the next 10 years, mostly driven by Medicare and Social Security. And then, of course, the pandemic began in the early 2020, and that just blew the doors wide open. And we actually have had 2 years in a row, 2020 and 2021, of $3 trillion deficits, both of those years. Okay, so an annual deficit of $3 trillion. So we've actually added in the last 2 years, our debt went from $24 trillion to $30 trillion, right? We added $6 trillion to the debt because of these two $3 trillion deficits. So we find ourselves in a huge hole at this point. The government servicing of that debt, the interest that it has to pay, is growing. At this point, it's about 7% of the total budget just to pay the interest on all of this. And everybody expects that that's going to get worse. And it probably is going to rise to 10, 15, possibly even 20%, crowding out much of the other spending. If all of the spending is required to just service the debt to pay the interest on this debt, it's going to make it very difficult for the government to continue with Social Security payments and Medicare payments. And of course, now what we're finding out in the last 2 weeks, of course, defense spending, which is the third largest component of spending. And that makes up only about, only about $700 billion out of about $6 trillion budget. 1.3 trillion dollar for healthcare programs, about $1.1 trillion for Social Security, and $700 billion for defense spending. So that's the government spending. And that's why it's very difficult to actually cut any of these things. The largest two components are promises that we have made to our elderly, to the retirees. And they are going to be in a world of hurt if we start reneging on those promises. And the third component, the third largest component, is national defense, which is, of course, now we are finding out pretty important, continues to be pretty important. So I'll just finish up by saying, why do we see this sort of a thing? Um, there is a whole area of economics called public choice economics, which uses tools of economic analysis to explain politics, to explain political institutions and behavior of politicians. And we understand that politicians, the successful politicians, the ones that get reelected, are the ones that ultimately are able to get the most re-election campaign contributions, and are able to therefore provide the greatest benefits to special interest groups. The truly honest, moral politicians that are trying to work for the people, they are not going to get rewarded. And every politician that we have seen that has gone in with the intention of keeping, reversing this trend of massive deficits has ended up actually just getting crushed in re-election campaigns. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but it doesn't pay for politicians to actually try to make the government fiscally responsible. They will not reap the benefits of that. In addition, they're going to make enemies of all of the other congressmen who want to continue that kind of those kinds of spending programs, understanding that's how they will continue to get reelected. So we have what economists refer to as highly perverse incentives that are facing politicians, which is why we keep being so frustrated with politicians. And again, on both sides, unfortunately, that's the nature of democracy. And that's why one of my highly respected professors, I got my PhD from George Mason University, as you mentioned. One of my professors was a Nobel laureate who passed away a few years ago. His name is James Buchanan. And James Buchanan was one of the founders of public choice economics. And he ended up talking about a lot of this stuff and explaining that really the only solution is to actually have a balanced budget amendment to constrain the government and keep it from continuing these deficits. Even though there are problems with the balanced budget amendment as well, it is not an unmitigated good. There are some downsides, but given the current situation, it does seem like probably the best solution. So I'll stop there and we can discuss it.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating.
Thank you
And
very much.
you did such a good job of consolidating so much information into a really short amount of time. I think I worked on the Hill for a number of years, and we've got a lot of listeners today who worked on the Hill. And one of the things I think that's interesting, first of all, is so few members of Congress actually have an economics background. And I wonder if that would help if we elected more economists. I remember Dick Armey from Texas was actually an economics professor.
Yes, he
And
was. Yeah, he was great. Yeah, I'll just say this. It would be nice to think that that's the case. The problem is not the people. The problem is the system.
the
And the
process.
system creates perverse incentives, as I pointed out. And even good people that go in there, and I've seen many good people that really had the best of intentions and understood exactly the issues, they were unable to really make very much change at all. Reform. We're not able to make any reform. And so it seems to me that we need to do something systemic, something that's going to change the incentives, which is extremely difficult because politics is always the same. And this is, by the way, why we find the same kinds of patterns, not just in the United States, but in most other industrialized countries. They're all running continuous deficits. That is just a permanent truth of politics, and why politics actually is highly problematic, and why we may not want to actually rely so much on political organization of our economy and political control of our economy. It's usually going to be destructive.
Well, and you make a good point with the systemic problems, and I'm wondering, as you pointed out, the deficits have gotten much worse in the last 50 to 60 years, and I'm wondering if some of that may have to do with the budget process in Congress. It does seem that that so often now so much of the budget process is bypassed with continuing resolutions rather than each appropriations committee consistently passing their appropriations bills, and the House Budget Committee doing what it's supposed to do. And I'm just wondering, have you or do you know if others have given thought to any sort of reform in Congress on the whole budget process?
I don't know. I would think it really wouldn't change things that much. It would help by having the entire budget process become more transparent, which I think is greatly lacking at this point. It is a huge issue, right? But I'm not sure it would fundamentally fix the problems. Even if you had a formal budget process, the regular order, as it's referred to, the same incentives would stay in place, and it would maybe be a little bit more transparent, and politicians may be a little bit more cautious in what sorts of spending programs they're backing. But I really don't. I think that would not fundamentally fix the problem. It would certainly be helpful, and I would very much be in favor of returning to regular order. But I don't think it's the driver of all the problems that we are seeing now.
Okay. Well, we have got some great panelists who I know have some wonderful questions, and I am going to turn it over to Jewel and Jorn.
Hello,
Thank you.
Jewel and Joey.
And if you have anything else you want to ask Kathy, please ask it whatever you think of it. Some just quick questions first. Is there a difference of how we should think of a budget and a government budget? When we think of a personal budget versus we're talking about a government budget, is there anything that we should just think differently about it?
That's a really excellent question. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this. It sounds like you might be. But there are a lot of people, particularly on the left, that have been arguing that there is a fundamental difference between the government budget and like a household budget, right? And that we can't think of it in the same way. And there is some truth to that. There's no question about that. Especially in the United States, the U.S. Dollar is the world reserve currency. It's the currency that is held by all other major central banks as their reserves. It's the currency that's used for all oil exchanges in the entire world. That's actually now somewhat being challenged, and as a result of the war in Ukraine and isolating Russia, Russia is turning more and more to China, and China has been wanting to challenge the US dollar as the reserve currency for quite a while. This may be the time. If that is a successful effort, which I think is unlikely, but if it is a successful effort, we're going to be in a world of hurt. We're going to be in serious trouble. But nevertheless, so just to get back to your point, the fact is that the federal government can keep massive amounts of debt for a pretty long time, maybe indefinitely, because it does issue its own money. So the federal government, not directly, but there is the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, and the Federal Reserve issues the dollar. It controls the monetary supply of the U.S. That's not something that a normal household can do, right? So that is a major difference. But in the end, the same kind of dynamics apply to the government budget that do to the household budget, which is that you can only sustain living above your means for so long. And there will be a time when that ability runs out, right? And that's much more constrained with a household budget. But it doesn't mean that there are no constraints when it comes to that with the government budget, right? So the government budget will be restrained, and I think we may be getting to that point. So let me just quickly talk about that, and I'll stop. But we have a situation now, as you probably know, that we have, and I mentioned it before, a $30 trillion debt, right? So we have to pay all of that interest on that debt. And the federal government has been, take your pick, lucky or has actually rigged the system in order to have extremely low interest rates on that debt. We have had historically record low interest rates for the last 15 years. So while the amount of the debt has been growing, the interest on that debt has been declining, kind of canceling out the detrimental effect of the rising debt. However, the problem is that in order for the government to continue to run deficits, it has to find people that are willing to borrow, to lend money to the federal government, right? So it has to be able to continue to borrow. And that borrowing ability very much rests upon the credit worthiness of the federal government. How credit worthy do potential lenders consider the federal government? Right now, the debt to the GDP ratio is 125%. That is unprecedented. We have never seen anything like that before, and that's going to continue to rise. So at which point do the potential lenders consider the US federal government to stop being so creditworthy? And in order to lend money to the US government, they will require much higher interest rates. At which point do, as a result of the Federal Reserve policies, do we start seeing rising interest rates? And as a result, the Federal Reserve is now talking about raising interest rates several times this year in order to deal with the rising inflation. And that's going to be a huge problem for the federal government, because if the interest rates rise, that's going to increase the cost of their debt servicing. So there are all these dynamic elements that are making for a pretty dangerous picture heading forward for the federal government, right? Will it be able to retain its credit worthiness as the the debt to GDP ratio continues to rise, and as interest rates return maybe to their historical averages? All of that is going to be that's going to cause a lot of problems for the government, and then it's going to find out what the meaning of the budget constraint is. Just because that budget constraint is looser for the government than it is for a household, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
So was there always a deficit from the beginning of the revolution? Like, did we enter into this with a deficit almost?
Actually, yeah. So, excellent question again. It's an interesting thing to look at that. So there were all sorts of maneuvers, mostly done by Alexander Hamilton during the founding of the US. Alexander Hamilton created this federal government debt as a result of the Revolutionary War, that he thought would bring the states together, the original 13 states, right, would bring them together. And he really pushed for the creation of the first quasi-central bank in the United States, which was the first bank of the United States, which existed from 1792 until 1791 until 1811. That's it, 1791 to 1811. And it was supposed to just kind of finance this debt. But actually, the debt, which was created as a result of the war, was mostly paid off by the time that the War of 1812 began. And the War of 1812 was the invasion of the U.S. by the British that lasted until 1815. The federal government got into quite a bit of debt again, but that debt was actually paid off in 1835. So we actually had some brief period there where there was no debt, where it was paid off. And then there continued to be periods of smaller debt, larger debt, but it was nothing like we saw today. And what we see actually is that there was a governing philosophy which expected the government to attempt to balance its budget. That was the expectation, that the government would attempt to balance its budget. The only time that government budget deficits would be justified was in times of crises. And of course, wars are the worst times of crises. So the largest debt we had seen prior to the recent period that we had seen the federal government accrue was during World War II. During World War II, it rang up a pretty massive debt, which was understandable. We had a world war that was really quite horrible and destructive.
And that kind of
But
brings
then,
us to the thought of, so if we're here constituting America, of course, so we're all about the Constitution. And when we think about these things, we try to think about them from the concept of the country, its founding, and the Constitution. So we when you think about everything you said, the system where there's basically messed up incentives. So the politician gets in and it doesn't make sense for them to do anything but raise spending. The thing on this show we would say is, well, there's something else that's supposed to be between them and spending, and that is the Constitution, which has been ignored in many, many ways. As an economist, would you say possibly like what would be the economist approach to that? Because the law approach may be something more so of, well, the Constitution's been violated, and that's really the issue in the system.
well, unfortunately, the Constitution has not been violated. So there is nothing that forces the government to balance its budget. That's a matter of constitutional requirements. So the Constitution does give the Congress the power to set its budgets, to determine its spending, and to determine the tax rates. And with the passage of whatever the amendment was, I can't remember now, in 1913 that introduced the income tax, the government is doing everything constitutionally. So it's now up to us to try to hold the feet of the politicians to the fire, but that's really hard. So another insight of public choice economics that I mentioned before is that in general, it considers the voters to be, as the phrase goes, rationally ignorant. And ignorant here doesn't mean a put down. It simply means that they are not well informed. And it's rational because we understand that each individual voter does not have very much power over this. And becoming well informed about these issues is not ultimately going to give you a great deal of ability to change anything. It'll probably just make you frustrated and mad. And that's the problem with the current system, right? So public choice economics is pretty, unfortunately, negative about the potential for the real kind of reform. But we do know that real reforms happen. And we know that it's not easy, but it is possible. So what sorts of reforms are necessary? So my professor, James Buchanan, that I mentioned before, that won a Nobel Prize for his contributions to public choice economics, he talked about constitutional political economy. How do you change rules at the constitutional level? And as Ms. Gillespie mentioned at the beginning, something like a balanced budget amendment would probably go a long way to getting us to trying to right the ship, right, to fix this problem. But it's going to be a hard going because nobody in politics will want to go along with that. They will lose a lot of their ability to actually give money to preferred special interest groups and continue spending as much as possible. So just one final thing about public choice economics. It says that politicians suffer from the short-sightedness effect. That's actually an official term. Short-sightedness effect means that they're simply focused on the next election. And they don't really care about the long-term consequences of these policies because if they don't get reelected, it doesn't matter to them, right? So they need to get reelected, and that makes their incentives extremely short-run oriented. And that, unfortunately, is not the incentives that we as a society should have. As a society, we should actually be looking at the long-term consequences, and that's just not what our politicians are incentivized to do. See, I told you it was going to be depressing. Sorry.
Was there ever really a challenge to raising the budget?
As in limiting the budget of each yearly budget?
Well, I mean, there are always some congressmen that are fighting for that, but they're in such a minority that, they have been mostly ineffective.
More so
Um,
falls on deaf ears
yeah,
at that
exactly.
point.
Yeah, actually, so again, a public choice economics concept is, well, actually, I'm not even sure. I think it's actually a phrase that comes from politics itself. It's called log rolling, which is where politicians work together and they say, hey, here is my preferred spending project. I really want this to happen to get money into my district or my state or to this particular special interest group, right? If you agree to vote for this spending project, I will agree to vote for your spending project, which is going to be going to your preferred constituency, right? These kinds of deals are made all the time in Congress. So and you have many of these deals going all along, which means that any people like, I don't know, Ron Paul, Rand Paul, people like that, right, that have really tried to fight against increased government spending, they're just going to get crushed. I mean, they may make, they may vote against it, but it's going to be usually a token vote.
Is it true that all Social Security revenue has been spent, not been spent on Social Security? I know that back when we would have different campaigns, that was often one of the criticisms. Can you say anything about that?
Sure. So there's this fictional lockbox that some people have talked about, which is supposed to contain all the funds that the baby boomers have paid into Social Security, and that's supposed to be there for them, to cover their Social Security payments. Alas, that lockbox does not have money. It has government IOUs. So the federal government actually started raiding that lockbox and using those funds, I should say, for general spending and just putting in uh, debt notes into that supposed lockbox. So this is a huge problem, right? It means that Social Security payments that have to be spent right now have to come from the general revenues, general tax revenues, rather than coming from the payments that have been made into that lockbox by the baby boomers through these decades.
Is there a cost, you said, of healthcare, defense? Is there a cost attributed? What is there a number, a figure that we would give all of the governmental organizations like EPA, FDA, and the different organizations like that, the administrative state or whatever we could call it?
Oh yeah, so yeah, there are various kinds of administrative items in the budget that provide the budgets for all of those agencies, and there are obviously some agencies that take care of these healthcare issues and then social security issues, but there are obviously all sorts of other bureaucracies that take care of infrastructure spending and various other regulatory expenditures and things like that. So there is that. I can't remember exactly what the name for that part of the budget is, but you have about a $6 trillion budget at this point. 1.2 trillion for Medicare and Medicaid, 1.1 trillion for Social Security, 700 billion for defense. So that's about $3 trillion, right? For just those three items of the $6 trillion budget. Okay. And then you have about half $1 trillion. So about $500 billion for the interest on the debt, on the $30 trillion debt. That leaves about $2.5 trillion to be spent on discretionary matters and various administrative matters and infrastructure matters. So that's all that money that goes to those items, to that expenditure. And but that's really, I think we all expect that that's going to be a fundamental part of government spending. We don't necessarily mind that, but obviously I should say, obviously, it's not the primary driver of the massive increase in the budgets. It's the spending on Social Security and Medicare. That's the primary driver.
So I was looking at a debt to GDP chart, and I was just trying to see where it ebbed and flowed, and I saw around World War II, there was a huge increase, as you said, but we were able to correct. Right after that, yeah, I'm assuming it's correct. Obviously, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we went way down all through the 50s and really got back to where it was before the war up until, early 60s. So why were we able to correct then and not now?
Um, a lot of it has to do with the political will, and I don't think there is any political will at this point to do such a thing. But also, if you look at the kind of spending at that point, once the war came to an end, and we brought back all those young men from the Pacific and Europe, right? I think we mobilized something like 15 million men during World War II. And obviously, there was massive spending on armament and various other kinds of things, right? And once the war came to an end, you bring all those young men back, you send them back into the civilian force, and the spending drops precipitously, right? It just, there's no more need for that spending. At that point, there were not these structural problems with the budget, such as the Medicare and Social Security issues, right, that are really driving so much of the fiscal problems that we are facing right now. So you cannot do that. That was temporary increase in spending. It was a temporary increase in spending because there was a massive crisis, a world war, right? And so we saw that, of course, now with the pandemic, the last 2 years, where there was a massive increase in spending, and we've brought that down, right? So it actually looks like the deficit for this fiscal year, 2020 fiscal year, is going to be back to about $1 trillion, just a little bit more. $1.3 trillion are the projections that I'm seeing right now. So you can do that, but that's not going to fix the problem. We actually have to have a situation where we start substantially cutting the budget across the board, and nobody wants that, right? Cutting the budget across the board will mean cutting back on the Social Security benefits, cutting back on Medicare benefits, cutting back on the national defense. Every one of those things has a huge constituency that's going to be extremely unhappy about those things. Okay, so there is another thing we can do. We can try to actually increase the tax revenues, right? And for many people on the left in the Democrat Party, this is their solution, right? That we need to raise the tax revenues in order to be able to fund all of this stuff. And in theory, that is absolutely possible. What we find, though, is that when you start raising tax rates, and in particular, the left is always in favor of taxing the richest people. They think, you got to stick it to the wealthy, right? They've gotten their money through some ill gains or whatever. They can afford it, whatever the justification is. The problem is that the richest people in our country, they can do two things. One, they can move. They can go somewhere else. And they do. I think the most recent example of that is Elon Musk moving all of his operations from California to Texas, and California now losing a great deal of tax revenues, right? We've seen actually many countries that have had very high tax rates that have lost most of their most productive members of the economy that simply moved to a different country. And, the richest people are in the position where they can actually move. That's not an option that we have, move to a different country. That's oftentimes not an easy thing to do, but it's an easy thing to do for the wealthy. So I can, I love rock and roll music, and I love to talk about the examples of the Rolling Stones becoming tax exiles. When Britain actually had in the late 60s and the 70s, they had 95% top marginal tax rate. So that's the tax rate on the top part of their income. They moved to France. Paul McCartney, one of the members of the Beatles, he figured out he could avoid the taxes by recording in different countries. So he went to Nigeria to record one of his most popular albums after the Beatles, Band on the Run, in 1973. In 1977, he actually got two boats, put a studio into one of those boats, and sailed them into the international waters outside of the British Virgin Islands. And then he had to pay no tax whatsoever, right? The Bahamas had one of the most famous studios where AC/DC recorded and Iron Maiden recorded to avoid taxes. So that's one thing. The second thing
Yeah,
is that the rich don't have to actually continue being productive. If you start taxing them a lot, they're going to start, spending more of that money rather than continuing to make that money, which is going to be taxed. So what do we find, to just wrap this part up, is that even with very high marginal tax rates, as you start increasing the marginal tax rates, what we find is that the federal income tax revenues as a percentage of the GDP tends to be remarkably constant, about 18% of the GDP. And it doesn't matter, how high the tax rates are, how low the tax rates are. In fact, I have this great graph here. Let me see if I can find it very quickly in the, let's see. Here we go. This actually shows you, and this is from the textbook that I used for my principles class. Let me see if I can bring that up here. It shows you the percentage of the tax revenues paid by the top 0.5%, so the highest earners in the United States for the last 60 years. And it shows you as the marginal tax rate was decreased, that the richest ended up paying higher and higher percentage of the total tax revenues. Which seems counterintuitive, but if you have a high marginal tax rates, you're punishing work. And people, if you punish work, people are not going to work. And then you're going to have less tax revenues. If you have lower tax revenues, you're going to actually reward work, and you're going to end up with more economic activity and more tax revenues. So while the left is always saying we can fix this problem on the revenue side, tax revenue side, I don't buy that, actually. I really just don't believe that. I think the problem has to be fixed on the spending side.
Well, that's
Thank you for a
great.
lot
And
of great,
Jill and Jordan, thank
audience
you
questions.
so much for all your questions. We've got the audience is got so
Excellent
many
questions, by the
questions.
way, fellows. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Those
thank
were really
you.
good.
Really great questions. And we've got the greatest audience members. They've got some wonderful questions as well. First of all, I want to give a shout out to my dad, who remembered that we were talking about Phil Graham, who was an
Phil
economics
Graham, that's
professor at
it.
Texas A&M University.
Yes.
So I should get in trouble for that because I'm a graduate of Texas A&M University. But
Good call. Good
thank
call,
you for
Dad.
remembering
Yes.
that. And then Jonathan Nash asks, was there not at some point a law that required the federal government to produce a balanced budget? And I wonder if Jonathan's talking about the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act back in, I believe it was 1985, that first introduced the concept of sequestration. And we originally, that eventually went away, but would you want to say anything about that, or?
So yeah, honestly, I don't remember that much about it. So as you pointed out, it went away, I think, about 10 years ago or so,
Yeah,
I think under
yeah.
Obama.
Yeah.
So I haven't really given it very much thought since then. So I will probably get in trouble if I talk about it, but it's basically, it's irrelevant, so the government makes up their rules, and that's the benefit of having a constitutional amendment, right? Is that the government cannot just decide that they're going to ignore that particular rule, right? Abandon it.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, that was a rule that was not at the constitutional level, and the government decided to just ignore it and abandon it.
And, one of the brilliance of our founding fathers is that they gave us two ways to amend the Constitution. So we're not dependent on the Congress, giving us a balanced budget amendment. We can do it through the people, through Article 5, Convention of the States. Bill Herrenberg wrote in with that and said, as of this morning, 18 states have passed such a resolution. This effort includes drafting constitutional amendments for term limits and limiting the size and scope of the federal government. So there is a movement out there for the balanced budget amendment. But then we've got so many other questions as well. I wanted to get to, let's see, Mary asks, are there states that manage their budget and deficits well? If so, which ones?
So this is again getting outside. I wasn't ready to talk about that. That's not part of my expertise.
Yeah,
I think yes, but I can't really speak to that. So I'm mostly focused on the federal government.
yeah, no, I
Apologies.
understand. No problem. And then we had another listener who wanted to know if there's a good textbook that you could recommend that might help us understand this better. You just held up a textbook that you use. Is that your
Yeah,
book?
I actually I can write well. Okay, so this is a textbook that we use in for most of our principles of microeconomics and macroeconomics classes. There we go. Um, at Hillsdale College, and I think it's a phenomenal textbook. So it's by Gwartney, Stroop, Sobel, and McPherson. Economics, Private and Public Choice, and now in the 17th edition. And it has multiple parts of the textbook that discuss a lot of these issues that we talked about here today. There's also a great textbook I can recommend called The Economic Way of Thinking by Paul Hain, Peter Betke, another one of my professors, and David Prochitko. So that's a really good one too that will discuss these issues. I can actually point out that there's a phenomenal book that deals with these issues that was published in 1977. And it was published by James Buchanan, who I brought up several times by now, and one of his students that actually ended up becoming one of my professors and was on my dissertation committee. His name is Richard Wagner. So in 1977, Buchanan and Wagner published this book called Democracy in Deficit. And what they pointed out is that that as a result of the Keynesian economics revolution, it kind of opened up the Pandora's box of government deficits because Keynes, I don't know how much your listeners know about Keynesian economics, but that really revolutionized economics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it continues to very much inform a lot of politicians and how they think about the economy. I do not like Keynesian economics. I think it's completely wrong and it has serious problems, but it's out there. The Buchanan Wagner book, Democracy in Deficit, pointed out that what Keynesian economics did is justify deficits as a necessary part of the government's economic stabilization policy. And once actually there was this veneer of scientific justification, and I use scientific loosely here, politicians went hog wild. It gave them what they ultimately wanted, which is the ability to spend without having to worry about balancing the budget. Prior to that, if the government ran budget deficits prior to Keynesian economics, so the 60s really, if the government ran budget deficits, it was considered to be an emergency situation, and the expectations were that there would be a return to balanced budgets as soon as possible. Once Keynesian economics came in, it changed everything. And that's why we now have 62 years of almost completely continuous budget deficits. So it's a huge problem. That book actually is excellent for anybody that has a deeper interest in it. And I'll finish with this. I remember having dinner with my professor, Richard Wagner, one of the co-authors here, in 1998, shortly before I left George Mason University. And actually it was dinner with my parents as well, and my dad is an economist as well. We were talking about various kinds of economic matters. And I remember him back in 98, he said, the deficit issue and the budget issue and the debt issue is the one issue that I'm so pessimistic about, that I feel absolute despair over. That was when the debt was about $4.5 trillion. Okay. And we have seen the debt go, because of all of these accumulated deficits, to $5 trillion in 2000. After the two terms of George W. Bush, it went up to $10 trillion, doubled in 8 years. Obama attacked George W. Bush a great deal, rightly so. And then Obama he doubled the debt from $10 trillion to $20 trillion in his 8 years. And I thought, okay, well, they can't double the debt again in the next 8 years. And here we are 5 years after that, and it's gone up from 20 to $30 trillion. And God knows where it's going to go from here. We are seeing a massive rise in the debt that was unimaginable to people 20 years ago. And my professor despaired about it back then. He's still actually working at George Mason. I would love to talk to him and ask him about that now. I can't imagine he's feeling much better about it.
Well, thank you. And I wish that we could get to some more of our audience questions, but we are at time. But there's one very important input from a member of the audience. Ruth Ann Sumter says, Professor Pongracic, your mother and the rest of the ladies of Portfolio Club are proud of you.
Shout out to my mom and all those ladies, as well as my in-laws who I think have joined in as well, and possibly some of my students too. So hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
And we are so honored to have you with us here today. And thank you for all that you taught us, because I know we all learned so much. And I want to give a special shout out to our sponsors, Linda and Arthur Dingy of Arlington, Texas. Linda and Arthur, we're just so appreciative of you all making this program possible. Y'all are such great patriots and citizens. And I had the pleasure of meeting you in person a few years ago. And we thank you for all that you make possible that Constituting America does. And I want to thank Jewel and Jorn and Aubrey for all the ways that you contribute to these constitutional chats and our audience. And we want to ask that y'all come back next week, Tuesday at 2, when we're going to be talking about trade and imports and exports and the effect of all of that on the economy. So we hope y'all will come back and join us. So thank y'all very much.
Thank you so very much. It's been a
you.
real pleasure and an honor to have me. I appreciate it. And best of luck with the organization. I think you are doing wonderful work. It's badly needed.
Well, thank you. And thank you for all that Hillsdale does. Y'all are such a great help to us and our programs. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be part of Hillsdale College for sure. Thank you.
Bye.
All the best to you.